Hey everyone, Chris Lambert with Film Colossus here, narrative expert. I'm going to be ranking and reviewing 3,000 Years of Longing. This is one that's going to be very special to a lot of people. It's a movie about loneliness and admitting to yourself that you want to love and be loved, and what that means, what that looks like. It's overall a very sweet movie, and for the people that it connects with, it's going to connect hard. Like, people are going to have a visceral reaction to this. They're going to defend it. It's going to be something that makes them feel seen and heard in a way that few other movies ever have. And that's really powerful. That's really beautiful. If you connect with this, you will ride for this movie for the rest of your life. And you could just see, like, down here, film critic David Jaffe just talks about, I was blown away by this movie. I found it utterly hypnotic, and I didn't want it to end. Like, that's a very powerful reaction that I think many will have, but it's not quite the reaction that I had. I'm so into narrative and narrative dynamics and structuring that for me, I just wanted a bit more from this movie in terms of the storytelling, which is ironic because it's a movie about storytelling and the power of stories, but the main characters are so static that you spend the first 90 minutes kind of just stuck between them having a conversation, which is cool and not necessarily a mistake, right? Or bad writing. It's a choice by the filmmakers, but I think it kind of robs the movie of a lot of forward momentum and makes the last act feel very rushed and maybe not as satisfying for someone like me as it would be for David down here, or some other people that really connect with the core emotion of this film. It just left me wanting a little bit more. It reminds me a lot of Big Fish and Shape of Water, if you've seen those movies. Big Fish is a father-son story where the father's on his deathbed in the hospital and the son's reflecting on their relationships through the stories that the father always used to tell, these tall tales about the biggest fish that you've ever seen. And these stories always bothered the son, but in this moment, they become a source of closure and connection, and it's very powerful, the character journey. And there's something in that vein here with Jin and Jin's stories that he's telling to Tilda Swinton's character. And I just need to say that Idris Elba and Tilda Swinton do a phenomenal job. I love them. George Miller as a filmmaker, I was so surprised by this because I just think of him as the Mad Max guy, right? These sci-fi, or not even sci-fi, like post-apocalyptic movies. To see him do something that's this, I want to say grounded, but it's not grounded, but it's taking place in our modern day. And while it has these surreal and fantastic elements to it, the visual eye that he brings to this, the patient filmmaking, is just not what you'd expect from the Mad Max guy. It's such a polished auteur sensibility. You're like, oh, why hasn't he been making these movies his entire career? And now I want to see him make more movies like this. It's just, I think the third act leaves me wanting a lot. And when I think about it in comparison to Big Fish, it's just, the point that it's making about stories, I think, is better done in Big Fish. And then Shape of Water, the romance between two creatures from completely different worlds, right? A human and this sea entity, or a human and a djinn. I think Shape of Water developed the romantic elements just a bit more, where 3,000 Years of Longing just kind of tells us Tilda Swinton is longing and lonely without ever really showing us her home life or developing it. We're told, and then she's just kind of happy. And there's some sadness that results, but she's also just kind of happy. So her character journey is very kind of even-keeled, because even when she's missing love, we don't see her as terribly unsatisfied with her life. So I think it just doesn't quite hit the right narrative notes for me, leaving me wanting more, leaving me a little disconnected from the thing that it really wants me to connect to. But again, if you're somebody that connects with it, you're going to love it more than maybe most things that you've ever seen in your life. So it's definitely worth seeing to see if it has that grip on you. There's also, I think, to the credit of the movie, a duality to the storytelling. There's the fairy tale version of events where you take the fantastic elements at face value, but there's also a grounded, realistic way of viewing things that reminds me of Pan's Labyrinth. That movie also has that duality between, do we believe the fantastic or do we just take this as a very tragic story involving imagination? And this wouldn't be a tragic story involving imagination, but it would mean that the story is more imagination of somebody developing a story, writing a book, right? Which is something she tells us up front. Like, Tilda Swinton's character is very much like, hey, you may not believe this happened, but this really did happen, but I'm going to tell it like a fairy tale. So it sets up at the very beginning this idea that maybe things didn't quite play out this way, but if you want to buy in and believe in the fantastic, you should. But you can also find a much more grounded reading in it. It's nice. I like duality. I like the layers, but I don't know if that necessarily accomplishes quite as much thematically as it did in Pan's Labyrinth, but I'm sure you could make a counter argument as to why it works. But in terms of ranking, this will disappoint some people. I have it down in the neutral category at the very top because while there's so many pros and while I think the potential that this movie will have, like the ranking that some people will have it, will be much higher, for me, I just couldn't get over the lack of narrative momentum, that the characters were sitting for so long that even when they did change location, when something did happen, I don't think the actual events that happened in the story were all that compelling, especially the final, and not the final twist, but just the climactic, like, oh no moment felt kind of cheesy for me. And the fact that there's kind of a blunt and random critique of technology, like modern technology and British racism, was a little jarring to me, of those kind of flying out of left field and being like, hey, aren't these things problems? Okay, now we're ending the movie. It's like, is that part of it? Should we have been reading into these aspects as themes this entire time? Have you been developing these things? Not really. So do they fit? Should I be as flabbergasted as I am that they got brought up, or should I be hailing it for including such like statements? I don't know. So there's just enough that I complain about that I'm having it down there. It's above Death on the Nile though, just because I think Death on the Nile is a similar movie. Kenneth Branagh's directing is very nice and beautiful and patient, but I think it's also a movie that suffers from a lack of narrative momentum, and the ending doesn't quite have the payoff that you would hope for, especially for the investment that you put into it. So you're just kind of left going like, well, that was okay. But I think the potential in 3,000 Years of Longing is much greater, and that the high points, especially in some of the fantastical cinematography and some of the shots, just far exceed Death on the Nile. So there's a pretty big gap, I would say, between 20 and 21. But I just don't think there's enough positive that I want to put it above the neutral category. I just have enough complaints that I'm not doing that. But it's below Fresh, just because I think Fresh, even though it's a smaller movie, it doesn't have the scope. I don't think it has the visual power that 3,000 Years of Longing has. Fresh just is doing enough narratively and thematically that I enjoyed the journey of that more, I think, than I did in 3,000 Years of Longing. Like, I wasn't longing for as much narratively as in Fresh. So that's why Fresh is above 3,000 Years, and why 3,000 Years is ahead of Death on the Nile. But, you know, maybe it'll rise up the ranks. Maybe I'll keep thinking about it and be like, you know what, that was great. I'm actually going to move it all the way up here to 12. Probably not, but, you know, there's potential. I will say, though, in terms of recommendations, that there are going to be people that love this. So if you're not sure, or maybe if you're watching this, you've already seen it, but it's definitely worth people watching just to see how they react to it. If you hate it, you hate it, but there's the potential you love it. So that's it. Until next time, cheers.